Can you hear me all right now? Thank you. Let me start over. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and members of the Presidential Commission on Elections Administration for inviting me here today, and on behalf of the Florida government and citizens of Florida, a very warm and sunny welcome to Miami-Dade County. Continuing to improve our election system is a critical task for our nation's democracy, and it's a task we embrace year-round here in Florida. I would like to spend my allotted time talking about the 2012 general election and how we continually work to make voting experiences in Florida here better year-round. From a statewide perspective, I believe Floridians had a positive election experience in 2012. More than 8.5 million Floridians cast ballot in our general election, which was a Florida record. Of these voters, more than 2.4 million voters cast their ballot at an early voting site, and nearly 2.4 million voters cast their ballot by mail. This turnout is a clear demonstration that Florida is doing the right thing by being one of only 26 states in the country that offer both early voting and no-excuse absentee voting. But as always, after an election, we found that there are areas that need to be improved upon. So last December, I traveled across the state at the direction of Governor Scott and met with election experts to learn how we can do a better job and make sure that voters know that improving the election system is an ongoing effort that takes continual innovation. My conversations were candid, direct, and focused, and they were held with people from varying political parties, interests, backgrounds, and from different parts of the state. I asked the tough questions about why some voters' needs weren't met to the fullest extent possible. And in some cases, I found that the most fundamental functions of elections administration failed. The most prominent areas I heard needing improvement involved taking further steps to increase the accessibility of our elections. Even if it's only a few precincts, there's no reason why Floridians should have to wait in line for hours to vote. Several factors appeared to have contributed to Florida's long lines at the polling places. These factors included a very long ballot, fewer polling locations, a record number of voters, and in some cases, poor planning by supervisors of elections. Knowing this, our department presented Governor Scott and the Florida legislature with a set of recommendations to resolve these issues. After a collective effort that continued through the recent legislative session, Governor Scott signed bipartisan legislation that allows more Floridians to vote and to do so in a timelier manner. For example, this legislation increased early voting days from 8 days up to 14 days, and from a maximum of 96 hours to a maximum of 168 hours, a record number of early voting hours for Florida that includes Sunday voting before the election. This legislation also expanded the allowable number of early voting sites. Among many other improvements, the legislation also addressed the issue of the long ballot by limiting the number of words the legislature can use to the proposed constitutional amendments to the same as citizens' petitions. And these are just a few examples of improvements that we've made. In addition to these steps at the statewide level, I intend to hold local public officials accountable to do what they need to do for their constituents. The local administration of an election is the key component to the success of any election. All Florida supervisors have a responsibility to ensure fair elections. One county that doesn't properly serve its voters does a disservice for the entire state and has the potential to cloud the positive steps taken by the rest of the state to conduct fair and accessible elections. The bottom line is voter confidence needs to be restored and maintained. Voters are relying on us to ensure their elections are accessible, efficient, and fair. In a decentralized election system like we have here in Florida, supervisors of elections and county commissioners must take it upon themselves to oversee elections through responsible leadership and efficient administration. Similarly, the Florida legislature must ensure that Florida has the best election laws possible in which supervisors of elections may operate. And of course, the Department of State Division of Elections has a responsibility to the voters as well. Technology changes, needs change, voter behavior changes, and experience always demands more innovation. But I am confident that we can do a better job for our citizens because every election can be improved upon. Florida is soon to be the third largest state in our nation. We do not intend to settle for good elections. We have a responsibility to conduct great elections here in Florida. Elections are a symbol of our nation's freedom, and we need to show the world how great it is to live in our country with a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Thank you for your time and your commitment to improving our nation's election system, and I'm pleased to take questions at whatever the appropriate time is, Mr. Chairman.
We do have questions, and Commissioner Britton, please.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Very, very good to hear from you this morning. Of course, selfishly, being a citizen of Florida, I was excited about today. You had mentioned a few specific things that you've done here in Florida. Are there things outside of those that you would say are most important that still yet need to be done? Could you be specific maybe about what some of those things are?
Well, I would say that one thing that this commission might focus some attention on is, technology is almost outstripping our capacity to bring the technology to the voting public. And I would suggest that the commission take a serious look, maybe a small committee, at the certification process of voting equipment. We here in Florida have very high standards. We think that it's important to hold vendors to the very high standard. And when vendors are not performing to that standard, the legislature this year gave the Secretary of State additional enforcement authority over vendors that are not providing the most updated equipment. But I think this commission could do well to provide additional timely certification of technology going forward.
Great, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Commissioner Grayson. Good morning. It was good to hear you say that the reform package was passed in a bipartisan way. I'm just curious, during the legislative process, were there recommendations that dropped out through the process? And if there were, was it political reasons? Were they maybe more substantive, or there was just a genuine disagreement on what worked? I'm just curious how that process worked.
Well, there were, first of all, it was a bipartisan effort. There were some minority opinions that we should mandate certain things to supervisors. And one of the things I learned by meeting with the supervisors in December, and their valuable input, because they are the front lines in election, was that they needed flexibility. So there was a great debate with regards to should the legislature and state government mandate certain requirements and rules and regulations to supervisors, or should we give them the tools to have flexibility? Florida is a very large state with multiple different micro elections populations and cultures, and we think that supervisors are best equipped to make judgments about how people need to be served, both with locations, time of service. So the debate between mandating and flexibility was the majority of the debate during the legislature this year.
Commissioner Patrick.
Good morning. Good morning, there we go. I guess I had a question. In the testimony, there's a lot of discussion about the roles and responsibilities of the local administrators. And we've talked to other secretaries of state and state elections directors, and as we know, every state's a little bit different in how decentralized or centralized they are. But in a decentralized construct like you have here in Florida, what role do you see as the Secretary of State that you have in ensuring that all of these things do get done, or that the overall environment is improved? What supporting role do you play to the local supervisors?
Yes, ma'am, that's a great question. The primary role of the Secretary of State is to provide uniformity in interpretation of the statutes of Florida. We had a very active and lively debate this year as to whether or not, as the chief elections officer, the chief election officer should require a little more accountability of the independently elected supervisors. That was a very healthy debate. I think it was good. In the end, the legislature determined that the supervisors are the lead for conducting elections, but uniformity of enforcement of our election code and understanding of our election code is the primary function that I have. But, as I said in my statement, I intend to use my position to hold public officials accountable for their service. And shortly after the election, I wrote every county commissioner in the state of Florida to address the issue of failure to fund supervisors of elections offices adequately. In some counties, because of budget cutbacks, because of the downturn in the economy, we had one county in Florida that I called an underperforming county that went from 170 precincts, because of budget cutbacks, had to cut back to 120 precincts. So when you look at the fundamental part of turnout and long lines, the administration of an election goes back to the very fundamental things of how many precincts do you have, and do you have enough voting equipment?
So you see it more as a kind of an enforcement role then?
Well, actually, no, an oversight and uniformity, but the secretary does not have real enforcement authority over the supervisors. It's the voting public that provides the accountability to each independently elected constitutional supervisor.
Thank you.
Commissioner McGinn.
Good morning. I was interested about the reform legislation that passed and the balance, obviously, between local control and state oversight. Did the reform legislation set up any minimum requirements concerning a minimum number of early voting locations that were required, maybe based on county population? Did it get that specific? Or?
No, there was a debate and there were proposals, conceptual proposals about tying sites to population bases. But in the end, it was the argument that supervisors know best as to what the demands are. And I think what you'll see is in solving this problem that the number of locations that were increased dramatically will offer supervisors additional options to provide more access to voters. And ultimately, I think we will solve that problem, and I think we're well on the way.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Commissioner Thomas.
Good morning, Secretary.
Good morning, sir.
I was on a conference call with you this past week with the National Association of Secretaries of State on emergency preparedness. And you had a number of officials from the state that deal with emergency preparedness. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how you're set up, what your experiences have been. Obviously, Florida has been through a number of natural disasters and has recovered quite well.
Well, thank you. You know, Florida is very proud of its emergency response program, whether it's during an election period or not. Governor Bush and Governor Scott should deserve a lot of credit for what they have built as a emergency recovery institution here in Florida. We get visitors from all over the world all the time. But one of the things I stressed in our conference call this week was that a commitment to emergency response during an election period is not a single agency response. It's not just the Department of State or supervisors of elections. It requires the coordination of the entire state, whether it's Florida or any other state, and local governments. That the capacity to bring resources to bear, if it's in a small geographic area or a large geographic area, require commitment of all levels of government. And in planning, I suggest that all supervisors and all state departments meet with their emergency management programmers at the state level and local level and begin to develop, if they have not, a plan of action so that they know where resources are. Here in Florida, the Department of State really acts as a bridge between the local supervisors and state emergency management and the local emergency management programs to bring assets where supervisors think they need assets in a time of an emergency. But if I might stress one thing, it is not a single agency or single entity in government. It is an experience that ranges across state government lines from local to state, including volunteer organizations, religious groups, and also the National Guard.
Commissioner Lomax.
Larry Lomax. I'm from Las Vegas and responsible for putting on the elections there. I just have a question on your early voting, going back to that. Why the legislators felt it necessary to lay out maximums as far as providing voters an opportunity to vote?
You know, that's a good question, and that was debated. Should we have minimums and maximums? And you know, at some point in time, I like to parallel voting and the service of voting to our electorate as being in the retail business. And you know, you've got to decide how many hours you're going to be open and what you can afford to do. And the reality is that we need to meet the demand of the voting public. And so as part of our input and looking at the numbers of how many people demanded, it used to be when we had a minimum number of days that oftentimes in the early voting of an early voting cycle that people wouldn't show up. They would wait till to the very end of the cycle. So we tried with input from the supervisors and voters and constituency groups to come up with the best formula that we could that met the demand, yet still allowing for flexibility for the supervisors to organize and find locations and have set periods of time, but the time gives them flexibility. There's not a minimum, there's not a maximum, gives them flexibility.
Can you give me an idea what the limit is? Because it says you expanded the allowable locations.
Right. It used to be the locations were limited to supervisors' offices, libraries, and now we expanded it to include civic centers, sports stadiums, government facilities. I mean, it quadrupled the number of potential sites that are available,
Is it
including
the number or the type?
the type.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
All right, thank you.
Commissioner Echeverria.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Secretary, thank you for being here. And as one of the 8.5 million people who voted in the state of Florida, I'm particularly interested in your observation. So, two parts to my question. First, you mentioned that it was a record turnout and that there was, in general, a good experience for most of the voting public. So if you had to do directional math, the first part of my question is, how many of those 8.5 million do you believe, the state believes, it was a good, positive experience? That's number one. And two, what would be the one thing, in the chair you sit, that you would put at the very top of your list to enhance that experience for those that it wasn't? The one thing. I realize there's lots of things. Would it be macro planning? Would it be making choices against a budget issue? Would it just merely be the accountability? So I appreciate your observations.
Well, I like to say that because the fact we had a record turnout, I think that's evidence that people had a good turnout. People were excited about this election, and I think that their enthusiasm, turnout, and vote was representative of a record amount of votes. You know, on the second point, I just think that what's really important to understand is that in administering these elections, you need to be able to forecast changing attitudes, changing behaviors, and while a presidential election is very different than a statewide election, which we'll have here in 2014, the fundamentals of planning are still the same. You cannot assume if you've been in office or you're a county commissioner and you're having a downturn in the economy, that you can cut back on the services relating to voter turnout and the needs that supervisors have. And so when you have a cutback in the budget of a supervisor, they have to make decisions. And they have to make decisions about voting locations. And I think it's important to keep the public attention and my attention on local public officials to make sure that as they plan and they go forward, that they're planning with the right formulas. We have great models here in Florida of successful election programs, and you have representatives here of some fantastic supervising efforts. I think some sharing of information between supervisors on best practices would be very important, but I think resources from county commissioners to support these supervisors is very important. I think we've done the job at the state level to give the tools and the flexibility to the supervisors going forward in preparation for next year's election and the next presidential election. But even at that, a next presidential election is 4 years from now. We need to be innovative and attentive to the changes that will occur in technology and voting behavior. If we do that, we will be a very, very good example to the entire country and to the world about how to conduct elections.
Thank you. Commissioner Mays?
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I know that most of us are acutely aware that the population is aging rapidly and that kids born today may live to be 100. So if you were to think about the unique issues that the aging population raises, as well as those with disabilities, have you spent time thinking about how to address that, and do you have ideas about the best way to do that?
I'm wondering if, at my age, that might have been a directed question, but but no, thank you for that. I do appreciate that question. My mother, who passed away last fall, was 96 years old, and she herself wanted to talk about elections last year and how important that was throughout her life. I think one of the things we can do better, both here in Florida and around the country, is manage outreach programs to seniors, whether they're in institutions or not. And I think we can use our faith-based community to do that. I think we can use organizations within the communities. I think it does take some resources, and HAVA money can be used to do that. But I think we could probably go back to looking at who does the best at outreach programs and implement some of those programs at the local level. But I think it's something that often is forgotten as we get excited about the process and we look at turnout and we're excited about the electronic media campaigns. I think some of those fundamentals to bring the voting opportunity, the people that may not have the access, whether it's elderly or handicapped, is important to continue and to look at best practices and see if we can do a better job.
Nate Pursley, our Senior Research Director.
Thank you. One of the difficulties in studying the problem of long lines is we actually don't know where in the state people were waiting for a long time unless the media reports it or if someone complains. And I was wondering if there's any effort on the part of the state to actually measure in a systematic way where there were long lines or where there will be long lines in the future, how long voters in different parts of the state are waiting. So then we could actually, or then the state could actually address whether it's a localized problem or whether it's sort of more statewide.
Mr. Chairman? Well, I think it's fair to say that the greatest problem was in urban areas. And I think if you go to each area, as I did in December, and have conversation with supervisors, I think they were very candid. I think they knew what their problems were. I was here shortly after the election in Dade County. I met with Penny, the supervisor, who was very candid about, and the mayor, who was very candid about what they thought one of the problems were that contributed to that was not re-precincting, which was needed to be done prior to the election, meaning as populations change and move, you need to redraw and have your precincts drawn to meet the population growth. The second thing was electronic poll books. They're still using the old paper poll books here, and the mayor said to me candidly, he said that was a mistake that we made. We need to appropriate money for electronic poll books here in Dade County so people don't have to wait in line while the volunteers are flipping through the paper books, that they can use an electronic means to identify that they're a voter, and they can move through the line more quickly. So it's some real basic fundamental things of projecting and planning as to where your populations are, where they're going to turn out, and adjusting the model appropriately. So it was very basic and fundamental, and I was very pleased that Dade and many of the other counties stepped up and said, hey, we recognize what our problem was, but you need to help us at the state level with increasing the number of locations and increasing the number of hours for voting and giving us the flexibility. So as partners with the supervisors, I think we have come a long way, and I want to compliment them for being candid and forthcoming about problem solving, and that's the way we get it done here in Florida.
I guess my question is really looking forward. How will we know where? How will the state know where the long lines are occurring, except from the supervisors? As opposed, when the cameras are not on northern or central Florida, and they're often down here, how will we know whether there were long lines there, or is it really just from the feedback that you're getting from the? So, I mean, would you be doing, say, surveys to figure out whether voters in other parts of the state have been waiting in long lines, things like that?
Well, we have an ongoing conversation. In fact, we just had the Association of Supervisors meeting recently here in Florida, and supervisors know very well where their long lines were, and I anticipate they'll be making adjustments in the future elections, whether it's a local election, statewide election, or national election. So again, they are the front lines in the administration of an election, and it's their responsibility to know how to meet the demand for that voting public. It's not to wait in line. And anything we can do at the state level to support that, we will do, but it is their responsibility.
If I might, Mr. Secretary, thanks again for joining us.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman.
You mentioned in your testimony that Florida has a decentralized system. There's some historical evidence to suggest that's the case. And you're surrounded by supervisors. In Florida, your supervisors have a great deal of autonomy and authority, as you said, and that one of the challenges for your office is uniformity. Not looking at Florida, but looking beyond the country as a whole, do you believe that a system with a lot of control in the counties, as opposed to a state centralized system, is a model that improves election efficiency or runs into more challenges?
No, I believe that the best model is a local-based model with checks and balances in it. And in our case here in Florida, I think that the Secretary of State could have some additional authorities to hold supervisors accountable. We'll address that in the future. But the fact is that the supervisors need to be held accountable by the elected public. They are elected constitutional officers. Should they not do a good job, they can be voted out of office. That's the most accountability that you can have in an election system. I think the further that you get away from the elected public, the electorate, the less accountability you have. So it's a balance between the services the federal government can help us with, what I can do as a state elected official, but the rubber meets the road between the supervisor of elections in Florida and the electorate. And I think that's a good system.
Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Secretary. Very helpful.
Yes, sir.
One point that you emphasized repeatedly was innovation, developing, I guess, within the election administration sphere as much as possible, a sort of a systematic attention to innovative practice. And you also talked about the importance of best practices sharing among supervisors of elections, county officials who are responsible for the conduct of elections. In your experience, how is that working? In other words, as particular planning techniques are developed, as problems are solved, as practices evolve, what is the current state as you see it of communication between and among those who are engaged in practicing elections that permits the transmission, effective transmission of innovative practices and best practices? How do you see that challenge, and how well do you think it's being tackled?
Well, I have to say that, you know, in a state as large as Florida is, with 67 counties and 19.3 million people, communications is always a challenge when it comes to planning. And because of the diverse population, the geography of Florida, you know, when you look at some urban areas, they can have 600 or 700 precincts. And when you look at the the issue regarding planning and the number of machines it takes and just the basic administration of getting all of that in place on one single day for an election, it is a mammoth job. And so what happens in Dade County or Hillsborough County or in Mr. Cowles County and Orange County, they are very different kinds of challenges because of geography, culture, language, but we can share practices, and these association meetings that we have are very important. You know, one of the things I learned during the election as part of this fact-finding trip was that in some counties, in particular in Broward and Dade County, we also had a problem with the U.S. Postal Service. And I would encourage you all to put this on your agenda as well. And we are having a meeting in the very near future with representatives of the U.S. Postal Service, because one of our problems, one of our great problems, was people were not getting absentee ballots on time. And because there was a consolidation of U.S. Postal Service offices, particularly here in Broward County, and I think Ms. Snipes might address that issue, we had a real problem of absentee ballots sitting on the floor of some U.S. postal offices. So I would encourage you all to look at that and ask the Postal Service to work with states, particularly Florida, to address planning going forward. There's no excuse why people are not getting their ballots in time. The other thing is a phenomena occurred this year that was one that we had not seen in Florida for quite a while, or at least the first time to this magnitude, was people using early voting rather than going to their voting sites. They were voting early, but they were also going to the supervisor's office on election day to vote absentee in the supervisor's office. And I think Penny from Dade County can address that a little bit more specifically later. But that created a real problem in terms of counting votes following the election. I will say this, there's a very big misconception about Florida's ability to count votes on a timely basis. Every vote that was cast before the election, either early or absentee or on election day, was counted on election night. But when you take Dade County, and Penny, you can help me later on if you would please, they had 54,000 absentee ballots placed at their doorstep on election day, and that is something that does not get counted overnight. An absentee ballot requires a manual process, a review, a comparison of the signatures, and I called Penny shortly after the election and gave her a great commendation for her ability to put a team together to count votes, those absentee votes, 24 hours a day for 4 days to meet the unofficial reporting deadline that she met. So that phenomenon has been fixed, I think, this legislative session, because if you want to vote on election day absentee, you'd better have a note from your doctor, your psychiatrist, or someone to say that you actually have a need to be able to vote absentee, and I think that goes a long way to solving the problem.
Yeah, and thank you very much. And if I
Yes,
could
sir.
just follow up. So you mentioned that the supervisors face different challenges, and surely that's true. And they communicate, for example, through, you say, the annual association meeting. But are there suggestions that you could make, or do you think that actually that addresses the need for systematic, and I'll obviously ask the same question of the supervisors, some systematic resource for sharing information so that the best practices that are developed or the particular challenges that are identified that might be common to the different counties circulate among them in a way that enables each to take advantage of the experience of the other?
Well, I think the combination of the association and my office, my division of elections, is the best funnel avenue for communicating that. And if anyone has additional suggestions, we'd be happy to implement them. But it's that constant line of communication for best practices that's very important. And I think we're going to continue to work at it. It's always a challenge.
So that's my last question then. So your office actually does play some role in circulating among the counties information both about challenges and effective ways that have been devised to address them.
Absolutely. We have memorandums of law. I can give directives to supervisors on best practices. It's not used very often, but anytime I see a practice that can be useful and helpful throughout the state of Florida, that is one of my challenges. And it's important to hear from supervisors. If they recommend a best practice that should be shared, we're more than happy to provide that as continuity. We're the bridge between supervisors in a lot of ways, and that's my job.
Thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
Commissioner Thomas.
Just a real quick question. What's your definition of a long line?
You know what, I get asked that question a lot. What's important to emphasize is not the length of the line, but the fact that the line is moving. We had lines that people were standing in line and the lines were not moving. The definition of a long line is anything that's inconvenient for the voters and waiting longer than what's appropriate.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. Extremely good of you to come here today, and very helpful testimony and very clear and illuminating answers.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.